Robin Drake had never been the kind of person who looked for trouble, and certainly not the type to create it. Her life was built on quiet repetition, deliberate focus, and unromantic but meaningful labor. Each morning, she woke before the sun, not because it made her feel alive or spiritual, but because the soil demanded it. Her rented plot of land, 20 acres of uneven, slightly acidic earth, sat at the edge of a growing suburban community. The land had been used and abused over the decades, first for grazing, then over-fertilized for corn, and eventually abandoned when property taxes began to outweigh yield. But where others saw depletion and inconvenience, Robin saw a project. She wasn't sentimental about the land, but she respected it in the way a mechanic respects a machine he didn't build but knows how to fix. She had a background in agroecology, a degree no one understood at family dinners, and a modest grant from the university's Sustainable Development Program. She wasn't saving the planet, she often said. She was just trying to give a tired field a second chance. She lived in a simple prefab structure on the property, about the size of a mobile home. Not because she couldn't afford better, but because she didn't need more. The inside was bare-boned but functional. An iron stove, steel sink, built-in storage, and books arranged in stacks more than on shelves. Most days were spent outdoors, tending to crop rotations designed not for profit but for healing. Cover crops, legumes, bioaccumulators, deep-rooted grasses. It was niche work, not flashy, but valuable to those who knew how thin the line had become between modern agriculture and irreversible damage. Robin's land bordered a freshly built residential development called Brookridge East, a name that tried very hard to sound old and established. In truth, the homes had gone up barely 4 years ago. Modern, beige-on-beige constructions with narrow driveways and aggressively curated landscaping. Most of the residents were professionals in their 40s and 50s, who had left cities in search of peace, unaware that their arrival would bring a different kind of war. Robin had stayed out of their way. She didn't attend the neighborhood events, didn't show up at block meetings, and certainly didn't sign anything that would place her under their jurisdiction. Legally, her land was separate, zoned as agricultural research space, and had been that way for decades. She wasn't part of their world. Or so she thought. On the morning that changed everything, Robin was halfway through her routine when she noticed something was off. She had just returned from the lower paddock, a spade in one hand and a soil sample in the other, when she heard a dull, rhythmic clank. Metal on stone, the sound of work not native to her land. The noise wasn't from her equipment, and it definitely wasn't from wildlife. She rounded the greenhouse to find 3 men in neon safety vests, one operating a small excavator, the others managing survey rods and flagging tape. A ditch, fresh, raw, and ugly, ran along the northwestern edge of her field, carving through the hedgerow she had planted 2 seasons ago to block runoff. The men didn't stop when she approached. They didn't wave. They didn't ask. Robin's voice was calm but firm. "You're on private land." The man nearest her didn't turn around. "Drainage improvement," he shouted over his shoulder. "Temporary access. Authorized." She stepped closer. Authorized by who? This time he looked up, pulling off his goggles. His face was sweat-glossed and impassive, like someone who'd repeated this conversation too many times in other places. "Board decision. Voted last week. We're just the crew." Robin stared at him. "I'm not part of the board. I didn't vote. No one asked me." "You sure this is your line?" the man asked, gesturing toward the ditch. "On our sheet, it's marked utility easement. It's legal. You can call them if you want." He pointed at a sign planted in the soil. Brookridge East Property Committee. Below it, in smaller font, the phrase, "Community Approved Maintenance in Progress." Robin didn't respond right away. She simply walked along the trench, tracing its path with her eyes. The line wasn't random. It sloped gently away from the backyards of Brookridge East, ran clean through her hedgerow, and ended, cruelly and purposefully, near her southern retention pond, where she kept overflow from her irrigation experiments. It wasn't just a cut through land. It was a funnel. She returned to her structure, dropped the sample jar onto the steel counter harder than she meant to, and stared at it, as if the dirt might give her an answer. She wasn't naive. She knew how people like the committee operated: quiet authority, plausible paperwork, and just enough public language to make protest sound unreasonable. Still, this was worse than she expected. She pulled out her lease agreement, spread the maps across the kitchen table, and ran her fingers along the boundaries. There was no easement. There was no shared zone. They had crossed into her land. Period. An hour later, she was standing in the local zoning office, a dull beige building that hadn't been repainted since the late 90s. The clerk was polite but slow-moving, the kind of man who prided himself on knowing exactly how much he didn't have to care. He pulled up the file. "Well, ma'am, I do see an updated map here. Just last month, actually. Property line's been adjusted slightly on the north end. Shows a shared drainage channel. Must have come through committee submission." Robin's stomach tightened. "I never submitted anything." The clerk shrugged. "Well, your name's not on the submission. It's a general adjustment under the Regional Environmental Coordination Policy. It went through during the last cycle." "Cycle?" "Quarterly updates. Public notice is posted in the Civic Center. Most folks don't check." Of course they didn't. Robin stepped back from the counter. "Who submitted the change?" The clerk squinted at his screen. "Committee representative. Marlowe, L. That'd be Linda Marlowe, I believe." Robin didn't need to ask who that was. She had seen Linda Marlowe exactly once. A large woman in a designer raincoat standing on the committee lawn, barking instructions into a walkie-talkie like she was staging a military parade. She was one of those women who thrived on power that didn't require elections, who used phrases like "for the good of the community" to justify bulldozing anything inconvenient. Robin had avoided her like a disease, and now that disease had found her. Driving back, Robin felt a familiar tension in her chest. Not panic, but pressure, like something had been placed there without her consent. She parked by the barn, stepped outside, and surveyed the line of scarred earth that now cut across her field like a wound. The work crew was gone. The sign was still there. She didn't scream, or curse, or cry. She went inside, boiled water, and made tea. Then she sat at her table, reopened her maps, and began marking everything. Not because she was preparing for war, not yet, but because she knew, with a clarity that left no room for hope, once someone digs into your land, they've already decided it isn't really yours. The next morning, Robin stood on the edge of her property with a legal pad in one hand and a camera slung around her neck. The air was heavy with late-season humidity, the sky a pale, uncommitted gray, and the ground beneath her boots was still soft from the previous night's rain. The trench cut by the committee's contractors had turned into a shallow, linear marsh, pooling with silty water and debris that had floated down from the adjacent neighborhood. Stray bits of mulch, plastic labels from lawn chemicals, and what looked like a disintegrating tennis ball floated lazily toward her retention basin. She crouched to inspect the flow. It was steady, not aggressive, but intentional, and undeniably one way. Someone had not only altered her land without permission, they had repurposed it. She took pictures from multiple angles, focusing on the direction of water flow, the debris buildup, and the dislodged sections of her hedgerow, then returned to the house to upload them. As the images loaded onto her computer, Robin opened a second window and began filling out an incident report for the university. The language she used was clinical, devoid of emotion. Unauthorized disruption of research environment, physical modification of test site, external source contamination. She attached the photos, uploaded a copy of the lease agreement with the property boundaries clearly marked, and sent the package to the dean's office, CCing the agricultural law advisor and the field coordinator. If anyone at the university wanted to question her next steps, they'd find the documentation already waiting for them. By mid-morning, she received a reply. Short but affirming. The university was suspending fieldwork on the site until the issue was resolved. Her research schedule was paused. Her funding, not yet in danger, was now under administrative review. Robin knew what that meant. It was the beginning of a slow, bureaucratic chokehold, a delay long enough to invalidate the current cycle, long enough to make reapplying cost more than it was worth. She closed the laptop gently and sat back in her chair, staring at the ceiling of her small home. There was no anger yet, just that cold, sinking understanding that the damage wasn't just physical. It had begun to spread into the framework of her work, the legitimacy of her presence on that land. Around noon, her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, the voice on the other end introduced itself as Marvin Kendall from the Brookridge East Community Committee, speaking on behalf of Chairwoman Linda Marlowe. The tone was performative, polite but so obviously scripted that Robin felt herself recoil even before he began the real message. "We understand there's been some concern about the drainage adaptation project initiated on the border of your parcel," he said, as if she'd tripped over a curb rather than had her land invaded. "I just wanted to reassure you that all measures were taken within the regulatory framework provided by the Regional Infrastructure Board." "I didn't authorize any measures," Robin said flatly. "Well, as you're likely aware, under the revised Community Protection Directive, cooperative runoff management is permitted within 2 meters of unincorporated parcel borders, particularly in flood-sensitive zones. And considering your area's soil density and slope, the committee approved a targeted channeling solution to prevent water damage to residential property." Robin didn't interrupt. She let him run out of breath. "We also assumed, given your field's layout, that the impact would be minimal and, in fact, potentially beneficial. Improved drainage is often cited as a positive outcome in perimeter plots." She could almost see him sitting at a desk, reading off a document written by someone else. "Is that your legal justification?" she asked. "Well, I'm not an attorney, Ms. Drake, but I do believe the board consulted with municipal planning during the process." "Then let the attorney talk to mine," she replied and hung up. She wasn't bluffing. That afternoon, she called a contact, Daniel Reyes, an environmental land use lawyer whose card she had saved from a conference 2 years ago but had never expected to need. His firm specialized in smallholder land disputes, often working pro bono if the case posed significant public interest. She explained the situation, keeping her voice controlled, even clinical, as if reading from a research abstract. Reyes didn't offer sympathy. He offered action. "I want the documents they used to push that boundary adjustment," he said, "and I want soil samples. If you've got runoff entering your experimental site, we'll need to establish chemical and microbial contamination. That puts you in a much stronger position than property lines alone." "I've already started," she replied. "That's why you're ahead of the game. Most people call me after they've already lost." Robin felt a flicker of calm. Not hope, just alignment. Someone who spoke her language. She emailed the photo set, the lease, and the county property maps. Reyes said he'd begin the public records requests immediately and loop in a hydrologist he worked with on agricultural encroachment cases. It would take time, and there was no guarantee the committee hadn't already covered their tracks. But if this turned into a fight, she wasn't swinging alone. Later that evening, she received another envelope in the mail, this one thicker than the usual flyers. Inside was a multi-page packet titled Notice of Cooperative Easement Participation. It wasn't a request. It was a statement declaring her land in active service of the Brookridge Stormwater Mitigation Network, effective the date of the excavation. The language was defensive, heavy with bureaucratic weight, and buried in the middle was a clause about fines for deliberate obstruction of established water flow. Attached was a crude schematic, a map of the neighborhood, overlaid with a bright blue line that ran directly from their streets to her pond. There was no signature from her, only Linda Marlowe's initials stamped at the bottom. Robin didn't slam the door or crumple the papers. She took them inside, placed them on the kitchen table beside the legal pad, and sat in silence. Outside, dusk settled quietly over the fields. The only sound was the steady, gurgling trickle of water, moving not by gravity alone, but by intention. She understood now. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't poor communication or lazy planning. It was a decision made behind closed doors by people who didn't think she had the means or energy to fight back. People who assumed that because she was alone, she was also powerless. People who viewed land not as something you live on and work with, but as something you extract from and reroute when convenient. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Robin poured herself a cup of tea and stood at the window, watching the faint lights flicker on in the neighborhood beyond the trees. Her land, her project, her name, none of it mattered to them. She wasn't a neighbor. She was a utility, a buffer zone, a sump pit, a convenient solution to a problem they didn't want to deal with on their side of the fence. But they had made one mistake. They assumed she would ask for permission to fight. Robin began the following day with a quiet kind of urgency. She didn't rush, didn't move frantically or with any visible stress, but there was precision in her steps, a mechanic stillness in her motions. The field was too damp to do anything productive, so instead she walked the perimeter, marking off every visible intrusion from the newly dug trench. The water level in her southern retention pond had risen an inch overnight, and the inflow had left a distinct murky trail down the slope. What should have been clean rainwater had a rainbow film on the surface and smelled faintly of detergent and metal. It wasn't imagination or seasonal runoff. It was clearly, unequivocally the result of redirection. Someone's gray water, dish soap, fertilizer runoff, lawn treatment chemicals was now her problem. She collected new samples and took notes, more for her own record than the university now, labeling each container with the precision of a pharmacist. Her experimental phase had already been corrupted, the data compromised, the timeline delayed. She wasn't waiting for permission to document a violation. She just needed to make sure that when this went to court, and it would, her version of events was airtight. That afternoon, the lab sent back preliminary results on the first samples she had submitted. The email was brief and unsettling. Elevated levels of phosphorus, surfactants, and a small but notable concentration of coliform bacteria. It was a confirmation that the runoff was not just dirty but biologically active. Wastewater from dishwashers or perhaps improperly filtered sump pumps. Robin closed her laptop, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled through her nose. This wasn't just about drainage anymore. This was about pollution. And with active microbial presence, her land could be reclassified as at risk. That meant state inspections, potential quarantine, even shutdowns if someone pushed hard enough. As if summoned by her thoughts, the roar of a pickup truck echoed down the gravel path that led to her property. She stepped outside just as it came to a stop, her boots crunching against the damp grit. Two men stepped out, one older with a clipboard and a polo shirt that clung to his stomach, the other younger, wiry, wearing a reflective vest and chewing a toothpick like it owed him money. Neither introduced themselves. The older one flipped through the clipboard and began speaking as if she'd invited them. "We're from the committee, here to assess the drainage completion zone. Got a few measurements to verify. Shouldn't take more than an hour." "You're not stepping onto my land," Robin said, voice level but cold. The man didn't look up. "Ma'am, it's designated shared access under Community Ordinance 7B. We're required to inspect the integrity of any flow system that crosses jurisdictional boundaries." "You created the system," she said, "without consent, without permits, and without legal easement. Step off my land or I'll call the sheriff." The man finally raised his eyes. "You can, sure, but you'll be holding up a state-level compliance check. I don't think the county's going to love that." Robin didn't move. She stared at him long enough for the silence to turn sour. Finally, he made a note on his sheet, turned back to the truck, and climbed in with a dismissive wave. The younger man gave her a long, deliberate look before joining him, the door slamming shut with a muffled thud. As the truck reversed and rumbled away, Robin took out her phone. Not to film, not to threaten, just to jot down the plate number and time. There was no anger in her, just data. Later that evening, her lawyer, Reyes, called with an update. The public records request had returned a copy of the drainage approval memo signed by Linda Marlowe and 2 committee members. No minutes from a public vote, no attached engineering report, just a generic map, a sentence referencing slope stabilization, and a stamped date that coincided with a holiday weekend, when most people were out of town and not reading community bulletin boards. They slipped it through while no one was watching, Reyes said. Classic play, but sloppy. No formal survey, no environmental review, and the land use policy they cite was repealed last year. They're betting you won't escalate. They're wrong, Robin said. She spent the next few days preparing. Not for a legal battle, but for containment. If the runoff continued, she'd need to shield her crops, redirect clean irrigation, and isolate the retention basin before the contamination spread further. She moved sandbags to strategic positions, reinforced old barriers, and installed a siphon to drain the worst of the incoming water into an unused ditch farther downslope, one that didn't risk tainting her soil. It wasn't elegant, but it would buy her time. Then, just as she began to feel one step ahead, they struck again. She returned from a brief supply run in town to find a backhoe parked at the edge of her field. No crew, no noise. Just a machine idling, facing the ditch like a dog waiting for a command. She approached cautiously but found no one. The machine was warm. It had been running, and the trench, already too wide, had been deepened. New PVC piping had been laid along the side, partially buried, snaking toward her retention basin with a slight gradient. They were preparing for permanence. On the ground nearby lay a rolled-up plastic banner, presumably to be planted once the job was done. Robin picked it up. Across the bright white surface in municipal blue lettering were the words, "Community Water Management Infrastructure. Do not remove." Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with fury so cold it felt like hunger. She returned to the house, sat at her desk, and began drafting a cease and desist letter. Reyes would formalize it, send it with legal language, but this draft, this was hers. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was precise, clinical, and damning. She attached the lab results, included the photographs, reference statutes with page numbers. It read like a thesis. It read like war. By the next morning, the backhoe was gone. So was the pipe. In its place were deep tire tracks and a soggy gouge in the soil filled with brownish water. The banner had vanished too, and in its place someone had driven a small wooden stake into the ground with a laminated note that read, "We appreciate your cooperation in advance." Robin didn't reply. She went inside, made herself a cup of black coffee, and stared out the window at the mess. Somewhere, someone thought this was over. A gesture of compromise, a retreat to save face. But Robin knew the rhythm of invasive species. They didn't retreat. They paused. They shifted roots underground. They waited. She had work to do. It took less than a week for Robin to realize the temporary withdrawal wasn't a concession, but a pivot. The silence that followed the unannounced excavation wasn't retreat. It was recalibration. The piping might have been removed, the banner gone, but the ditch remained, deeper now and lined with disturbed gravel that glistened wet even in dry weather. Something below the surface had changed. Robin noticed it during one of her early morning checks. An unusual warmth to the soil near the channel, the faint smell of plastic and copper, and, most tellingly, the lack of standing water despite several days of consistent rain. That water wasn't pooling. It was draining. Somewhere. She followed the trench, not visually but by ear, crouching to hear the faint but constant trickle coming from beneath the compacted gravel. It didn't make sense. Without an outlet on her side, There was nowhere for the water to go unless a new path had been laid without her knowledge. The next day, she brought a spade and began digging at the narrowest part of the trench, careful not to disturb the walls. Less than half a meter down, her blade struck something solid. She pulled back the gravel and unearthed a segment of black flex pipe. Not wide, but professionally installed, curved, fitted, and directed toward her southern quadrant, where an old, sealed drain from the defunct barn's washout system once sat unused and overgrown. She didn't need to dig further. Someone had tapped the abandoned waistline and redirected their flow directly into it, bypassing the visible pond entirely. They were using her own infrastructure against her. Robin stood for a long time, mud streaking her gloves and sweat prickling down her back, considering the implications. This wasn't just committee arrogance anymore. This was covert construction. This was property violation on a level that would raise eyebrows even at the county assessor's office. But calling attention to it now, while everything was still unofficial and obscured, would only result in denial or finger-pointing. What she needed was certainty. Not in what was happening, she already understood that, but in how to weaponize it. She called Reyes again, this time asking for a site assessment. Not legal, technical. She needed a hydrologist, someone who could evaluate the ditch, the pipe, the slope, and the flow, and put it in writing. Reyes promised to reach out to a trusted contractor with engineering credentials. While she waited, Robin prepared. She printed every map she had, highlighted the trench's trajectory, and began overlaying it with historical infrastructure diagrams from the county's archive. The old waste line had been installed in the 70s when the property still functioned as a dairy farm. No one had used it in years. The university had sealed it during renovations, and Robin had left it untouched, assuming it had no function. It wasn't even connected to anything anymore. Or so she'd thought. 2 days later, a tall woman in tan cargo pants and a faded forestry services shirt arrived in a white SUV with no markings. She introduced herself as Claire Reinhardt, an independent consultant contracted by Reyes. She shook Robin's hand firmly, gave the property a quick visual sweep, and got to work with practiced economy. Over the next 4 hours, she took slope measurements, surveyed the trench, inserted a small inspection camera into the pipe, and used a handheld GPS unit to log every point of entry and exit along the flow path. Robin followed quietly, answering questions only when asked, watching as Claire's brow furrowed deeper with each measurement. When she was done, they sat at the table in Robin's home while Claire reviewed the footage and pulled up satellite overlays on her laptop. "They're not just draining into your land," she said. "They're actively using your soil profile to accelerate dispersion. The composition of your southern field, loam-heavy, shallow bedrock, is ideal for passive absorption. The water isn't meant to be held. It's meant to disappear." "Disappear into what?" Robin asked. "Into you," Claire replied, tapping the screen. "Or more precisely, into your liability." The report arrived the next morning. 12 pages, densely worded but legally formatted, signed and notarized. It confirmed everything Robin had suspected. The trench had been engineered to connect directly into a decommissioned drainage system without permitting or review. The modifications risked backflow into her remaining irrigation lines and, worse, could cause long-term subsurface contamination if left unaddressed. It was, in the clearest terms, a weapon disguised as runoff management. With the report in hand, Robin and Reyes filed an injunction request to freeze all further alterations to her property pending investigation. But Robin didn't stop there. She printed 5 copies of the report, folded them into plain brown envelopes, and delivered them to the homes of the committee board members. No notes, no explanation, just the facts. For a full day, nothing happened. Then the letters began arriving. First came the cease and desist from the Brookridge legal representative, accusing Robin of harassment, obstruction, and unauthorized data collection. Then a second letter, this one thinner with a formal request for community dialogue regarding the drainage concerns. It was a pivot, an olive branch wrapped in a threat. Robin ignored the first, forwarded the second to Reyes, and spent the evening reinforcing her barriers. The committee wasn't backing down. But now they were playing defense. That night, as she walked the property line with a flashlight, Robin saw movement near the retention basin. 2 figures in dark jackets crouched near the tree line, not speaking, not moving toward the house. She didn't approach. She stood still and let the beam of her light land directly on them. One of the figures turned his face, caught in the beam just long enough for her to see that he wasn't a teenager or a vandal. He was older, calm, deliberate. When she didn't move, they retreated. Not quickly, not clumsily, just enough to disappear into the dark. Robin didn't chase. She walked back to the house, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand, making a list. They had tested her perimeter. Now she would test theirs. Robin had expected retaliation, but she underestimated how quickly it would come and how directly it would hit. 2 mornings after the engineering report was delivered, she found the fence along her eastern perimeter sliced open in 3 separate places. Not torn, not damaged by weather, but cut. Clean lines at waist height with the severed wire curled unnaturally inward, as if someone had reached through. No footprints remained in the muddy ground nearby. The night had brought rain, enough to erase the evidence, but not enough to undo the deliberate message. Robin didn't call the police. She didn't need a deputy with a clipboard to tell her what she already knew. This was a warning, or more precisely, a test. They wanted to see if she'd flinch. She spent the day replacing the wire, reinforcing it with steel cable she had stored in the barn, and mounting 2 passive infrared sensors. Military surplus, nothing flashy but effective. She didn't advertise the upgrades. She simply waited. That night, the alert came at 2:41 a.m., a single vibration on the phone by her bedside tied to the sensor's frequency. She dressed in silence, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside with a flashlight already in hand. She didn't sneak. She didn't yell. She simply walked the perimeter until the beam caught the back of a figure hunched near the trench. He wasn't armed. He wasn't fast either. He turned just enough for her to catch a glimpse of a laminated badge swinging around his neck before he retreated. Not in a sprint, but a steady, shameless walk, disappearing into the tree line toward the subdivision. In the morning, the trench had been widened by exactly 2 inches. Enough to be seen, enough to send a message. Robin didn't take it to Reyes. She documented it herself, dated and time-stamped, and added the new photo to the already thick folder she kept in the drawer under her kitchen sink. The report had not stopped them. It had provoked them. They knew a legal process would take weeks, possibly months. In that window, they were going to make her presence untenable. And then came Linda. It was late afternoon when Robin heard the unmistakable crunch of heels on gravel, deliberate and measured. She turned from the shed and saw the woman approaching, overdressed for the setting, layers of beige and coral that clung to her like a costume. Linda Marlowe didn't carry herself like a neighbor. She arrived like a corporate inspector, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, her smile thin and tight as if painted on for a photo that never happened. "Ms. Drake," she said, not waiting for a response. "I think it's time we talk." Robin didn't invite her closer. She stood by the open shed door, hands empty but posture unmoving. "I think we already have," she replied. Linda glanced at the trench, then the field. "You've made this into something it didn't have to be. We attempted cooperation. You escalated. You trespassed. You altered my land. That's escalation." Linda clicked her tongue once, a sound meant to express disappointment without emotion. "You're outnumbered here, Robin. This community is aligned. The board has support. Your field is a liability to people who've invested everything they have in their homes, in their families. Your refusal to participate makes you look unstable." "I'm not part of your board," Robin said evenly. "I've never signed a charter, never paid a fee, never voted in one of your meetings. This is private, agricultural land. You don't get to align me into submission." Linda stepped forward, ignoring the implied boundary. This land may have been forgotten for a time, but now it's part of something larger. The county wants cohesion. Zoning is evolving. Whether you like it or not, you're in the path of development. You can resist or you can cooperate. One of those options costs you less. Robin stared at her. "You're not offering cooperation. You're offering assimilation, like a virus." Linda's smile didn't falter, but her eyes did. A flicker, small but visible. "I'm offering dignity," she said, "for now." Then she turned and walked away, leaving the air thick with her perfume and threat. The next day, Robin received an official notice from the zoning board citing concerns about water safety and environmental compliance. Someone had submitted an anonymous complaint accusing her of improper waste handling and soil contamination. The notice requested access to inspect her retention basin and her plumbing infrastructure. She faxed the letter to Reyes and didn't wait for instructions. She knew exactly what this was, an attempt to flip the script, to turn her from plaintiff to defendant, to drown her in procedural noise. Within 24 hours, Reyes filed an emergency motion to block the inspection, citing pending litigation and a restraining order against any further modification of her land. But damage, as always, moves faster than justice. That week, she noticed changes around her property. A group of children no longer played in the trail behind the fence. Neighbors who used to wave now looked away. Someone posted on the community message board about a hostile woman poisoning the local water system, and though no name was attached, the implication was obvious. Robin didn't respond. She worked, she fortified, she observed. On a rainy Thursday, the tipping point arrived. The trench overflowed, not with rain but with a thick brown mixture that stank of soap, fertilizer, and something far more acrid. Robin followed the flow and traced it back to a new spout, hidden beneath a bed of mulch behind the committee's tool shed near the edge of the subdivision. Someone had laid a direct line, unregulated, and disguised it as landscape runoff. The pipe ran under the fence and fed straight into the old waste channel. It bypassed everything. No filtration, no valve, no consent. Robin documented everything, then went home and prepared. She activated the reverse siphon in her retention basin, a long-planned measure that would take any overflow and redirect it upward through the sealed pipe and back into the trench, now no longer a ditch, but a delivery route. Then she waited. Not long. The next morning, residents of the subdivision awoke to a thin stream of foul water bubbling into their backyards. Not flooding, not dramatic, just slow and steady enough to soak their decorative mulch, curl their manicured lawn edges, and carry with it the unmistakable stench of human neglect. Robin didn't watch from her window. She went out to the field and worked. She pruned the cover crops. She adjusted the slope guides. She fed the chickens. The wind carried faint voices, angry and confused, and then the sound of someone knocking on her gate. She didn't answer. By sunset, she had 38 missed calls and 2 voicemails from the county. She let them sit. The water would speak for her now. The morning after the water reversed its path, the tone of the conflict shifted completely. Robin woke not to the hum of cicadas or the far-off murmur of lawnmowers, but to the hard knock of an official hand against her front door. It wasn't loud or panicked. It was procedural, firm, almost bored. Through the window, she saw a county vehicle parked half on the gravel, half on her grass, its tires stained with the same runoff she'd redirected the day before. A man in his 50s stood outside, dressed in khakis and a county-issued windbreaker, holding a clipboard too thin for a real inspection. Robin didn't open the door immediately. She walked calmly to the back room, pulled a folder from the shelf, and returned to the front hall. Only then did she open the door. "Miss Drake?" the man asked without preamble. "Yes." "I'm here on behalf of the Environmental Health Division. We've received a formal report regarding hazardous discharge affecting residential properties adjacent to this lot." Robin said nothing, only extended the folder. Inside were copies of the engineering report, the original cease and desist, the satellite overlays, and a notarized affidavit from Claire Reinhardt confirming that the source of the discharge had originated within Brookridge East. The man skimmed the top page, eyebrows twitching slightly, but he didn't argue. He accepted the folder and stepped back. "I'm going to log the complaint and include your documentation. Until further notice, I recommend halting all activity involving the waste channel." Robin didn't respond. She nodded once and closed the door. 2 hours later, she received a call from Reyes. His voice was calm, but there was a current underneath. Measured, quiet fury. The committee had filed a formal injunction against her, claiming that she had deliberately contaminated shared infrastructure and caused public health violations across multiple homes. Reyes was already preparing a counterfiling, which included photographic evidence of the illegal connection into her decommissioned pipe, the lab results from her field, and the professional analysis from Claire. But court would take time. In the meantime, she was likely to face further inspections and, if the committee had their way, forced cessation of all agricultural activity on her parcel. Robin went outside. Her field looked calm. The rain had passed and the grass glistened wet but undamaged. The trench was still full but now silent, a long, stagnant artery of resentment. Across the fence, the subdivision seemed unusually quiet. No children, no joggers, no dogs barking behind plastic fences. Only one figure moved openly. Linda Marlowe, standing in her side yard in a floral robe and thick-soled sandals, yelling into her phone with one hand and gesturing toward Robin's land with the other. She looked less like a leader and more like someone who'd lost the map entirely. Her gestures erratic, her voice carrying across the damp air like a siren of confusion. Robin didn't wave. She didn't look away. She simply stood there until Linda turned her back. That evening, Reyes called again. The judge had granted a temporary injunction against the committee's infrastructure activities pending review of Robin's evidence. This meant that, legally, no further trenching, piping, or waste redirection could occur without explicit court approval. But he warned her not to relax. "When power is cornered," he said, "it either negotiates or lashes out. And these people don't strike me as the negotiating kind." He was right. At 3:17 a.m., Robin's sensor triggered again. This time, not just one, but all three along the southern edge. She rose immediately, pulling on her coat and grabbing the flashlight. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of something sharp and wrong. Burned plastic, maybe oil. As she neared the trench, the beam of her flashlight caught the edges of movement. Two figures, hunched low, working with tools on the far side of the fence. One held a canister, the other a tool bag. They weren't boys. They weren't hired laborers. These were men who moved with purpose, fast and silent. Robin didn't call out. She didn't move closer. She turned off the flashlight, backed away into the cover of the greenhouse, and activated her backup recording system. The security camera mounted in the shed wasn't high resolution, but it was pointed directly at the trench and triggered by motion. When the men retreated 5 minutes later, leaving behind a smoldering object and the unmistakable hiss of tampering, she waited until they were gone before approaching. They had attempted to destroy the siphon valve with some kind of accelerant. It had melted halfway, the metal warped but not cracked. The soil around it had been blackened, but the pipe remained intact. Robin turned off the release mechanism, shut down the basin, and walked back to the house. Her breath was steady. Her pulse was even. She submitted the footage to Reyes at dawn. That afternoon, law enforcement arrived unannounced, not to investigate the trespass, but to escort a county inspector onto her land. The committee had pushed hard, likely leveraging local contacts, demanding an emergency inspection to evaluate the extent of the biological hazard, now threatening Brookridge East. The inspector, young and visibly nervous, followed Robin across the field while 2 officers stood near the road, watching her home like she might run. She said little. The inspector took water samples, looked at the trench, and asked perfunctory questions. She gave precise answers. At the end of the walk, he hesitated, then said quietly, "This shouldn't be happening like this. Off the record." Robin only replied, "It is." The final blow came not from the inspector or the police, but from Linda herself. That night, Robin found a note taped to her mailbox, laminated, printed in formal serif font, bearing the committee's seal. It was a petition signed by 28 residents of Brookridge East, requesting her removal from the neighborhood perimeter on the grounds of malicious non-compliance and environmental sabotage. It was absurd. It was meaningless. It had no legal weight. But it wasn't meant for court. It was meant for narrative, to shift blame, to make her the monster in someone else's story. Robin didn't tear it down. She left it there, fluttering under the porch light like a warning sign no one would heed. And then she did the only thing she hadn't done yet. She wrote her own letter. It wasn't sent to the committee. It wasn't filed in court. It was sent to the county zoning board, the Agricultural Development Office, the university, and the Regional Infrastructure Review Panel. In calm, factual language, she explained the nature of the modifications made to her land, the illegal connection to decommissioned drainage, the contamination of research soil, the sabotage of private property, and the documented evidence of retaliatory harassment. She included the names of all known participants, the signed petition, the inspector's photos, and Reyes's compiled filings. And at the end, she wrote one sentence in bold: "I request formal investigation and public hearing regarding the abuse of private infrastructure for municipal purposes without consent, permit, or oversight." The storm, at last, was no longer hers to carry alone. By the time the hearing date was posted, the air had changed across the ridge. Not dramatically, not with any explosion or public fallout, but with a subtle, widespread tightening of posture. People began watching each other differently. The manicured silence of Brookridge East was replaced with whispers. Quiet questions passed between front lawns and cul-de-sacs. A few houses had for sale signs staked in their yards by then, and more than one homeowner had begun looking at the trench with narrowed eyes and crossed arms. The letters Robin sent had been read, officially by agencies and departments, but unofficially too. They had rippled outward like water in a flooded ditch, touching desks, inboxes, and neighbors who'd never considered what lay beneath their suburban peace. It was no longer just a story about one woman and a piece of land. It had become something else. Something larger, more uncomfortable. A problem that couldn't be ignored without admitting complicity. The public hearing was held in the multi-purpose room of the County Services Building, a rectangular beige space that smelled faintly of floor polish and old HVAC filters. Robin didn't speak first. She didn't need to. Reyes presented the timeline, the documentation, the expert assessments. He was calm, clinical, and devastatingly thorough. Each exhibit, each photo, each time-stamped report unfolded like a trap door. When the representative from the zoning board tried to redirect, citing community cohesion and shared resilience, Reyes countered with state statutes and recorded easement codes. He made no moral argument, no dramatic appeals, only facts. When Linda Marlowe was finally called to testify, she arrived with a tight, bright smile and 3 folders she barely touched. Her voice had lost its certainty. The room, filled with residents, reporters, and quiet officials, no longer looked at her with deference. They looked with scrutiny. Robin watched her stumble through a sentence about infrastructure necessity, only to be reminded by the panel that no public emergency had been declared, no environmental clearance had been filed, and no soil survey conducted. Marlowe attempted to recover, citing collective will and residential consensus, but she was cut short by the board chair, who asked flatly, "Consensus over what?" her property. The final statement came not from Robin, but from a retired systems engineer named Owen Mercer, who had moved into Brookridge East 2 years prior. He stood at the microphone and calmly recounted how the board had discouraged him from attending meetings, how requests for infrastructure plans were met with vague reassurances, and how, after asking about the trench last month, his yard had been visited by someone who left behind a punctured sprinkler and a cracked garden light. He looked directly at Linda as he spoke, then turned to Robin and simply nodded. The ruling came 3 days later. The board was ordered to cease all physical intervention on Robin's property indefinitely. An independent environmental remediation team would assess the extent of the contamination at the committee's expense. The trench would be filled, the piping removed. Linda Marlowe stepped down quietly 2 weeks later. No public statement, no farewell note, just a moving truck and an out-of-state forwarding address. Robin received no formal apology. No one knocked on her door with an offer to make peace, but the silence changed. It was no longer weighted or judgmental. It became neutral, even respectful. A few neighbors waved again. One left a sealed envelope at her gate containing a note that said, "I didn't know. I should have." Inside was a small hand-drawn map of the original floodplain from the county archives. Robin tacked it onto her wall, not as proof, but as closure. By late autumn, the field had recovered enough to restart part of the soil rotation schedule. The contamination hadn't spread beyond the southern test rows, and the hydrologist follow-up deemed the long-term damage non-catastrophic but cautionary. Robin adapted her planting strategy, shifted the irrigation lines, and began rebuilding the buffer zone. She worked mostly alone, with the rhythm of someone who didn't need victory to feel satisfied, only the right to continue. On the last warm evening of the season, she sat on the back step of her home, sipping tea while the sun slid behind the trees. The trench was gone, the soil re-leveled, wild rye planted to hold the contour. There was no monument, no scar to mark what had happened, just a smoother patch of earth, slightly darker, quieter than the rest. The only trace that remained was the memory, not loud, but rooted. A kind of private truth. She didn't think about Linda. She didn't revisit the hearing or replay the arguments. She thought, instead of the old pipe, the forgotten infrastructure used against her and how she had simply redirected it, not with violence, not with revenge, but with precision. They had sent water down her throat, and she had taught it to spit. She stood, stretched, and walked the field one last time before dark. The rows were clean, the fences were repaired, the land, hers again. She didn't win. She endured, and that, she had learned, was enough.